In the second video, we're going to look at different approaches to thinking about prediction, explanation, causal inference, and we're going to focus in particular on thinking about the role of causal mechanisms in causal explanation and how that relates to case studies or qualitative methods more generally. So this first slide, there's a lot going on here. This is from an article by Henry Brady, a political scientist at Berkeley, and he outlines 4 general approaches to causality and explanation and prediction in the social sciences. I'm going to talk about each of these columns here a little bit, and then for the rest of this segment, this video, we're going to focus on mechanisms and capacities. At the end of this video, it's more a chance for you to write, if you're taking a class with me, to write up some questions that you have rather than any specific discussion questions that I will give to you as I did for the last video. Okay, so let's start off with this first column on the left, what Brady calls Neohuman regularity theory. Hume was a famous philosopher of science. He had a long and lasting influence in the way that people think about science and explanation and prediction and so on. And the modern variant of Hume's thinking are people who work, a lot of them in statistics, and they're looking at correlation. So correlation is a form of regularity, when things move together in terms of space and time and quantity, right? So Hume, to some degree, Mill, Hempel were authors in this tradition. Rubin and Holland are some more contemporary authors in this tradition. And so this approach focuses on looking for correlation. Hume started off looking at things like tides moving that happen to be correlated with the movements of the moon around the Earth. And so then you could infer that maybe, gravity of the moon was causing the tides to move because they were so tightly correlated, and indeed you could predict very well the tides from past behavior in the position of the moon. This looks at the temporal sequence of events. The moon and the tides are moving together in this example. It suggests that there must be some connection between these two because they're so closely correlated. It tends to look at the some in this tradition tend to look at the effects of causes. If this is my presumed cause, let me show the effects. The presumed cause is the moon. The effects are the tides moving in and out. Others tend to focus on the causes of, some focus on the causes of effects, some focus on the effects of causes. The tides are the effects, right? So the challenge for this approach is that you've probably heard the expression, correlation does not mean causation. So just because things move together, it doesn't mean that they're correlated. It doesn't mean that they're causal. It could just be what we call an accidental correlation. There are lots of things happening in the world, and sometimes they just accidentally look like they're moving together. Now, even if they're causal, it's not always clear which one is causing the other. It could be that A is causing B or B is causing A. Either way, they're going to move together. And it could also be that there's some causal relationship, but it's not A causing B or B causing A. It could be that there's some third variable, C, that's moving both of these variables here. And so just because we see a correlation doesn't mean that it is causal at all. And even if it's causal, the correlation doesn't necessarily tell us what is causing what. The second approach, which we call the counterfactual approach, this argues that causation or causal inference is related to counterfactuals. If we make a claim that A caused B, that suggests that if not A, then not B. The world in which A doesn't happen is the counterfactual world, right? So if we say that the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand caused World War I, that implies that had there not been the assassination of the Archduke, we would not have had World War I, or at least not in that way or at that time. In fact, there's a lot of historical debate over that particular counterfactual claim. Now, in some sense, any causal claim has a logically equivalent counterfactual claim, right? Again, that if A, then B logically implies if not A, then not B, or at least not B at the same time or in the same way or to the same degree or quantity. Okay? The challenge for this approach is that we never get to do a perfect counterfactual. We don't get to run history one time and then change one thing and then run it another time. So mostly counterfactuals are a way to sort of check on the consistency of our own thinking if we're convinced by a causal argument, but we're not equally convinced by the logically equivalent counterfactual, then we have to examine why there's some asymmetry or something missing in the way we're thinking about that phenomenon. So experiments kind of relate to this notion of counterfactuals. An experiment is when we have one group that we apply some treatment to, and we have another group that we hope is similar, and we don't apply the treatment to them, and then we see what's the difference in the outcomes for those groups. And ideally, we have a very large groups of treatment and control groups, and we perfectly randomly assign people or subjects to the treatment or the control group. And that can be a very powerful method if you have true randomization, which is actually harder to achieve than many people think. And if you have a very large number of subjects and that there's no imbalance between the subjects in the treatment and control groups. And randomization in large numbers are trying to take care of any possible differences between those groups before the treatment that's being studied. So this can be very powerful. There are more limited versions, which we call natural experiments, where nature or history effectively assigns individuals to treatment and control groups in an as-if random way. That's a strong assumption that it's truly as-if random or similar to random. But the problem for the experimental methods is that they can be very expensive and difficult, and they may be unethical on a lot of questions that interest us. We don't, start wars just to see what the difference would be if we didn't have a war. We don't start pandemics to see what the difference would be if we didn't have a pandemic. So they're not possible to do in a lot of settings, and indeed some of the demands to have a good experiment are stronger, the requirements are stronger and more difficult to achieve than a lot of people think. This is one of the findings in the replication crisis that I mentioned earlier. Now the fourth approach, and this is where I'm going to focus most of our attention, is on what's called the mechanisms and capacities approach to explanation. And this is related to the work of philosophers of sciences like Ram Hare and Nancy Cartwright. And so here we're looking to whether there's some plausible mechanism or process through which the implied cause, A, leads to and generates the observed outcome, B, right? So it's a time-bound process. Mechanisms operate in particular cases. We may see similar mechanisms in a population of cases, but whether what's going on in this case is the same as what's going on in that case is an open theoretical and empirical question in any particular research program or research project. So this focuses very much on the causes of effects. The cause is the mechanism, the effect is the observed outcome, right? And this is the approach that underlies case studies, and I would say qualitative methods more generally. So this is the approach that I'm going to focus most of our attention on. Now this next slide just summarizes some of the observations I already made on the table, so I'm just going to skip through this, and I'm going to focus on this question of causal mechanisms. Now, in the philosophy of science, the focus on causal mechanisms goes by different terms, but it's often called scientific realism or realism more generally. The term realism suggests that there's a real world out there independent of the observer, the scientist, or the participant, and that we're trying to figure out how that real world works, right? Now, there are some ambitious versions of scientific realism. Richard Boyd, for example, suggests that our theories, the ideas we have about how the world works, actually refer in some way to that real world, and that our theories improve over time. Now, the problem with this is we know lots of instances where science has gone in the wrong direction for some period of time and made claims that we later decide were false or inaccurate. And so, a lot of people are very cautious about making claims that science always progresses or that theories always actually refer to real things in the world. So a more modest version is that we have ideas in our heads, theories, that attempt to model the things that happen in the real world, and that we make trade-offs in the way we design our theories. We're worried about not making our theories too complicated. We want them to be somewhat generalizable. We may be more worried about having lots of different, or more or less worried about having lots of different moving parts in our theories, and so on. And so this is a much more modest version of scientific realism that I find I'm more comfortable with, and many others are more comfortable with. But still, this leaves open a very difficult question, and that is, how do we define causal mechanisms? What do we mean when we use that term? And there are many different ways that people have talked about this. Jim Mahoney has written an article where he catalogs something like 15 or 20 different definitions people have offered for this term causal mechanisms. So I think there's some bad definitions out there in the literature, some treatments that treat the words mechanism and theory as if they're interchangeable. To most scientific realists, they're not interchangeable. Theories are ideas we have in our heads about how the world works. Mechanisms reside in that real world, and they are actually how the world works, right? So put another way, theories are part of our epistemology, our way of knowing, and mechanisms are part of ontology, the actual real things in the world. And as we'll see later on when we critique this view, you could make an argument that it's different in human affairs because humans are, even scientists, are part of the social interaction that they are studying. And so whether that world is fully independent of any of us is a more complicated question than it is in the physical sciences, right? But still, we would maintain that there is a difference between theories in our heads and the way that the social world works, which is often independent of the behavior or the ideas of any one particular individual. A very general definition that John Daring offers would be that mechanisms are the things in the world that generate the outcomes that we observe. And there's nothing necessarily wrong about that, but I don't think it carries us very far in understanding the role of mechanisms in explanation. So in my own book with Alex George, following some writings of the philosopher of science Wesley Salmon, we defined mechanisms as physical processes that transfer energy, information, or matter from one entity to another entity in ways that change the capacities of the latter entity. I think more recently, perhaps a better definition comes from David Waldner, based on some other work in the philosophy of science, some later work in the philosophy of science. And his argument is that the thing that makes mechanisms special is that they involve some kind of invariance. Now, he doesn't mean a deterministic invariance. He would argue that even quantum relationships have some form of invariance. But his argument is that it's this invariant aspect of mechanisms that makes it possible for them to be offered as causal explanations. An example he uses is that, when we have a certain high temperature and we have combustible or flammable materials and we have oxygen, then we get fire. We could take away the materials, we could take away the oxygen, we could take away the high temperature, the ignition temperature, and that would prevent a fire from happening. But each time we have all three of these elements, we get fire, right? It's a little more complicated than that because often there's some other conditions we may have left out, like in this example, gravity, right? We sort of assume that gravity is, there when we see fires, which it is here on Earth, but it's not in space. And so fires behave differently in space, they have a different ignition temperature, and so on. So in more complicated theories about social life, there's often a lot of implicit or untheorized or unknown background conditions or other variables that allow mechanisms to operate. And a lot of what we're trying to figure out is not just how does the mechanism work, but under what conditions does it work? What implicit or previously unknown factors enable mechanisms to work? So it's a little bit more complicated in the social sciences, but I do think that there's something to this idea that it's the invariance of mechanisms that make them a piece of explanations, of causal explanations. And you could read some of David Waldner's stuff to get a more complete view on that. Okay, there's still, in this context, a lot of debates and challenges on what we mean about causal mechanisms. One is the role of unobservables. The way I think about this is that we can observe certain things with our eyes. We can also observe things with instruments of observation. Let's take an example from the evolution of physics, and initially we had this idea, this theory about molecules, and we couldn't actually see molecules, but then we got better microscopes and electron microscopes, and we could start to see through those instruments things that looked kind of like molecules. But then we could also push the border back to thinking about atoms, which make up molecules, and electron microscopes can sort of see some aspects of atoms or some implications of atoms. But then there's this question of subatomic particles, and we have theories about that, and we have various ways we try to observe them. And now the frontier of physics is to try to understand things that are even more unobservable than that, and we have ideas like string theory. And as yet, while many physicists have spent a whole career thinking about string theory or different variants of string theory, as yet we have no testable, observable implications of string theory that we can test in the world. So here, each time we push back the border between the observable and the unobservable world by using different instruments, but there's still always something that's unobservable or not fully understood or known beyond that barrier. And so, we'd like that it wasn't that way. We wish we had some godlike knowledge of everything, but it's just not the nature of how science works. So it may be regrettable that there's some unobservable aspect to explanation, but I think it's inevitable. This relates also to what we call the infinite regress problem. How far down do we have to go? How small a slice of space and time do we have to do to get to sort of some kind of ground mechanisms? And I don't think there's a universal answer to this question. We can model mechanisms within mechanisms within mechanisms, and how far down we go into smaller slices of space and time, it just depends on what we're interested in and what we're trying to explain. Right? So I don't think there's any universal answer to that question. We just make pragmatic choices about how far down we're going to go. Now, we're also at risk here. We can make one of two types of mistakes. We could keep going to smaller slices of time and space to try to explain something when really we're not adding much to the explanation, that a bigger chunk of time and space would be an adequate explanation. Or maybe we don't go far enough. Maybe we stop with an explanation based on molecules, but if we really looked closer and had an understanding of atoms, we would have a much better explanation. So we can go too far and we can waste our time, or we can go not far enough and we can miss opportunities for knowledge and discovery. And I can't give you some general universal rule about how we know when we've gone too far or not far enough, right? We'll make decisions on that in our research, but we'll never be fully certain that we've stopped at the right place, rather than gone too far or not far enough. This also relates to the idea of whether mechanisms can be probabilistic. I suggested earlier that they have some elements of invariance, but even there they could be probabilistic in some sense, as in quantum theory. And so here again, we can make a mistake in either one of two directions. We could treat things as if there's some kind of quantum style probabilism when, if we understood them correctly, they would reveal themselves as really quite deterministic. Or we could treat them as deterministic when really they're actually very probabilistic. And so we can make a mistake in either direction. Again, we'll never know for certain whether we've made the right choice between theorizing something or modeling it as if it were deterministic or as if it were some kind of probabilistic relationship. So we make choices when we stop in our research. If we stop trying to explain away anomalies or things that don't fit, we're acting as if the rest were probabilistic. And if we keep pushing to push down in smaller slices of space and time, we're acting as if we think there's something that's a little bit more invariant or a little bit more deterministic in there, that we could figure it out if we just look closely enough. And we'll make those choices. Again, we could waste our time by trying to go into really tiny slices of space and time, and we're not really adding much, or we could stop too soon, whereas if we just looked a little bit more closely, we would have had a better understanding of the phenomena. This relates also to what we call the question of methodological individualism. And this is, in the social sciences, do we always have to go to the level of the individual to explain phenomena? Or should we go into brain chemistry to explain behavior? Or should we go into subatomic particles to explain brain theory, brain chemistry to explain behavior? And again, we'll just make pragmatic choices here. In a sense, we sort of hand off the inquiry to other sciences at some point. Political scientists aren't all, brain chemists, right? And we'll hand that off to, psychologists and neurologists and so on. But at the same time, we should be aware a little bit, at least, of what's going on at that next level of analysis down. And we should be aware if the theories that neurologists have about how brains work are completely different from our implicit theories about how they work. I'll come back to this point in a minute. So we don't always have to go down to the level of individuals. Sometimes we can have structural explanations that explain things by institutions or balances of power or things of that nature. But those can be challenged if people can show that individuals don't behave the way that the structural theory says that they should. Okay, so sometimes it's more efficient and sometimes it's convincing to explain things at the structural level, and sometimes it's not, right? Okay, so this relates also to the difference between explaining by referring to laws and explaining by referring to mechanisms. Earlier, in one model of explanations associated with positivism, with Hempel and Hume, Hempel and others, argued that we explain things by finding law-like regularities of behavior. Well, that just begs the question of how do we explain laws themselves, and Hempel promised to do that, and he never really succeeded. This is one of the fatal flaws of the positivist enterprise, right? But you could just turn around and say, well, how is it different for me to say I'm explaining by reference to mechanisms as opposed to laws? But I do think there's a difference, and here's what I think is the essential difference. When we explain by reference to mechanisms, we're saying that we are making ourselves vulnerable to challenges that if we just looked at the next level down, a smaller slice of space and time, that you could show that our theory was inadequate or even wrong, right? Whereas the Hempel, going back to Hume view, doesn't always admit of that. The starkest example of this is an economist named Milton Friedman, who said basically in a famous article about the methodology of positive economics that prediction is the only standard for theory choice, and once we get predictions right, we don't care about things like explanations or processes or mechanisms. Now, most contemporary scientists, both in the hard sciences and in the social sciences, reject that view. Most scientists are interested in mechanisms and processes, and they do feel that if somebody can show at a finer level of analysis that their theory isn't working, they would accept that that's a problem for their theory. Whereas some other views, the regularity view taken to its extreme, does not admit that's a problem for their theory. And so this, I think, is the essential difference by explaining by reference to laws versus explaining by reference to mechanisms, right? Okay, there's also the question of how do different methods relate to the study of mechanisms. Now, case study researchers were some of the first and most forceful to say, we are studying the role of causal mechanisms in explaining the outcomes of particular cases. But a lot of people who use statistics would say, we're also trying to understand how causal mechanisms work. We're just looking at them at the population level, and we're doing observational statistics. And experimentalists would say, we're also looking at causal mechanisms, and we're doing that using experiments. So I would say people in these different traditions could all see themselves and indeed be doing science by trying to better understand theories about causal mechanisms. The difference is, in qualitative research, we're focusing on that in explaining one case at a time and its outcome, or maybe comparing a few cases, whereas in statistics, we're looking at populations. And in many experiments, we're looking at populations, right? The limitation of statistics and experiments is that even if you've got the proper causal explanation in general for the whole population, it doesn't necessarily explain particular cases in the population. We call this the ecological inference problem. So in general, smoking may relate to and indeed cause cancer on average in the population, but there will be some people that smoke a lot and don't get cancer, some people that get cancer without ever smoking. It's even conceivable that somehow some people may be less likely to get some kinds of cancer if they smoke, right? At least let's posit that as a theoretical possibility, right? So case studies are more sensitive to this kind of causal heterogeneity, differences in the population, and more cautious about generalizing from individual case studies. We'll come back to this question in some later segments. Okay, we could also have some interpretivist and postmodernist critiques of this view. I'm just going to preview these here and come back to them in the next video. These are questions I touched on earlier. You know, if we as a scientist are also part of the social world that we're studying, we're also influencing the social world by the way that we study it. So there's some endogeneity between social scientists and what they study. There's some endogeneity, some reciprocal causation between agents, individuals, and structures, institutions, laws, rules, organizations, and so on. And if things are really truly mutually causal or endogenous all the way down, how do we ever separate out, independent from dependent variables or causes from effects? Now, even most people who raise that question act in their everyday lives as if there's, as if we can sometimes separate out responsibility or causation between individuals and structures, and agents and structures, and causes and effects. But it still remains a general problem. Again, I'll come back to this. Okay, so that's some ideas about mechanisms. Let me ask, if you're taking a class with me, to just write down some questions you have about that or that arose in the course of this video. And then after you've thought about that for a few minutes, maybe taking a break, you can move on to the next video.